Okay, now
Francisco.
Yeah, it's done. Vocês sentaram no fim. Não, então não queres passar para isso? Eu posso passar eu, se preferires ficar tudo esta hora. Ok, ok. Está bem em cima? Ótimo. Bem, desculpem, sorry for this delay, but there was a technical problem. Luckily, it was well solved. At the end, I will thank Marta for all her work and all her support. Without her, we would not have the Zoom or YouTube live stream. So we have this section concerns indigenous and environmental rights. And we have with us José Pedro Monteiro, Dr. José Pedro Monteiro from the Communication and Society Research Center of the University of Minho in north of Portugal, who he co-edited a volume on internationalism, imperialism, and the limits of the contemporary world. No, the formation of the contemporary world at Palgrave recently, and also he published on the forced labor in Imperial Portugal from the 1940s to the 1960s, and he co-organized an exhibition on 150 years of abolition of slavery. And so he's going to talk about economic development, political integration, cultural and environmental preservation, the promises of Portuguese late colonial reformism in the 1960s.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like to start by saying thanks to Francisco Betancourt for inviting me to be here and say good afternoon to all of you. I have just two previous remarks I want to make. First, a substantial part of what I'm presenting today is still work in progress. Some of these ideas are included in a couple of recent publications, one of them in press, others I'm still working on them, so work in progress. Second one is that for this presentation, I tried to think on how my current research and past research can help us understand the complex, multifaceted relationship between empire and environment across history. Concerning modern European colonialism, I'm aware of the extensive literature dealing with, for instance, the impact of modern colonialism in Africa, concerning the practices of soil conservation or the protection of wildlife, among other aspects. Yet, I have a very specific focus here today. In particular, how can we think of environment, in particular, a particular critical juncture in the history of European empires, and in particular, the Portuguese one, when these formations underwent profound changes in both political, economic, social, cultural, and ideological terms. I'm talking about the final years of colonialism, or as commonly said, late colonialism, a moment shaped as well by the expansion of international institutions and international law, and by a new geopolitical constellation. Historical intersections between imperialism and internationalism are therefore central to my past and present research. This research is now more directly focused on the ways European colonial empires recalibrated the balance between the politics of inclusion and the dynamics of exclusion within a global order that gradually enshrined self-determination, democracy, and human rights as its main axis, at least in theoretical terms. So departing from these questions, I will tentatively suggest some ways of thinking about environment in the post-1945 Portuguese Empire, and more broadly, within the international normative order. Post-World War II years witnessed the emergence of a new global order, resulting in part from the creation of the United Nations system in 1945. Following the war, international cooperation appeared as a viable and necessary alternative to the interwar years' disputes. A myriad of specialized agencies was created, extending the reach and scope of the UN system, including financial and economic institutions, but also in domains such as health or intellectual cooperation. Building on interwar experiences, The war also prompted a new developmentalist ethos. The new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, offer distinct rivaling paths to modernity. Both of them promised a speedy transition to an expanding group of newly independent states, transition from what they see as backwardness to modernity. The United Nations itself increasingly looked for the decolonizing world as a privileged focus of intervention, relying on distinct specialized agencies to promote technical assistance programs that were subordinated to the development imperative. As Stefan Masakura pointed out, it was against the backdrop of the developmentalist movement that concerns arose within a cohort of international officials, scientists, and experts about the impact of too abrupt socio-economic modernization. Sharing to some extent some rational prejudices, they fear that the new governments in Africa and Asia would engage in full-speed modernization with dramatic consequences for the environment, soils, fauna, and flora. They would undo some of the measures enacted by European imperial governments to protect, for instance, wild park and protected species. New international non-governmental organizations were created with the aim of lobbying governments, both in the global north and the global south, to refrain from more violent and callous forms of its state and private intervention. Development imperatives were not to be abandoned, but they had to be balanced with environmental concerns. According to Masakura, these were the historical origins that led to the emergence of the concept of sustainable development in the late 1970s and 1980s. Here, I would like to expand and complicate a little bit this argument. During these years, a more complex interplay of historical processes was in motion. Both in colonial and post-colonial settings, the aim of material betterment and economic growth was often thought in relation with the risk of social, environmental, and political dislocation resulting from the abrupt interference in what were seen as traditional and untouched realms, both in natural and social terms. Alongside economic modernizations, concerns about political and social integration, or what political scientists will later call nation building, were a permanent concern of distinct governments in diverse geographies. Plans for economic and political integration, or even, and I'm using quotation marks here, assimilation, were frequently seen as threatening the preservation of traditional and natural spaces. Tensions between integration, incorporation, or assimilation on one hand, and protection, preservation, and distinction on the other, was a regular feature of political and scientific ruminations in both imperial and national formations. These historical dynamics, in turn, impended upon the formulation of specific programs and standards in international institutions, shaping a global conversation about the best ways to deal with culturally and ethnically different social groups. Naturally, late colonial European empires did engage in this conversation. This was not a new problem for empires in general, but in the post-war years, the question acquired new contours, especially in the international stage. This did not preclude imperial governments to put forward their own ideological arguments, which often did not succeed, but which had unintended consequences. I'll now move to two more specific, distinct, but interrelated cases. In the late 1940s, several reports started pouring in the Belgian Foreign Affairs Ministry, focus on the living conditions of, and I'm quoting now, indigenous backward populations. The information concerned distinct independent countries from New Zealand and Australia to Paraguay and Liberia, and including India, for instance. The incoming reports focused on different aspects of these living conditions: electoral enrollments and civil and political rights, social rights, land tenure regimes, or special regimes protecting traditions, customs, or ancient forms of political and administrative organization. This was not a random act. Instead, it was the result of a detailed questionnaire prepared by Fernand van Langenhove, one of the Belgian representatives at the United Nations. Their information demands and critical remarks about Belgian colonial policies in the Congo and Rwanda-Urundi were increasing in number and scope. Belgian representatives tried to reboot these accusations by favorably comparing the records with those of the independent countries which governed, and I'm quoting, backward populations, ethnically and culturally different. According to the Belgians, the United Nations discriminated against colonial powers stricto sensu, while at the same time left indigenous populations in independent countries and protected. Colonial populations were afforded international protection and, more important, were increasingly understood as entitled to the right of collective self-determination. That was not the case of indigenous populations in independent countries. According to the Belgians, self-determination was a right to be ascribed to populations, not territories. This came to be known in international law as the Belgian Thesis, which did not succeed. Instead, the so-called Blue Water Doctrine prevailed as the UN singled out overseas colonial territories and populations as subject of international supervision and entitled to the right of self-determination. This connects with the previous discussion about differences between land empires and non-contiguous empires, also about what's a nation state and what's an empire. I didn't want to talk about this because I didn't want to spoil what I'm going to say now. Sorry about that. On the contrary, Langenov argued that instead of political independence, the sacred trusts of all developed countries was civilization, or, depending on the context, development. Dozens of millions of indigenous individuals had no guarantees within international law. What was more, they could not be said to be self-determined, since most of them lived outside the reach of the national state, and they will add, civilization. As a Belgian diplomatic official put it, after meeting an enthusiastic and young Darcy Ribeiro, then working for the Serviço de Proteção do Índio, the Brazilians were protecting indigenous populations such as the Chavantes from civilization, while the Belgians were bringing the indigenous Congolese to civilization slowly and gradually. So-called Belgian Thesis was ultimately defeated, as Congo decolonization followed the pace in a few years. Yet, the idea of establishing international protection for indigenous populations in independent countries was not abandoned. The Convention on Indigenous, Tribal, and Semi-Tribal Populations, I could tell you a little bit more about the definition, but I don't have the time, was created in 1957. While there was no reference to self-determination, the Convention, to a certain extent, reproduced some of the Belgian arguments. To be sure, the historical origins of the Convention are to be found in International Labour Organization Andean Program and the Indigenistas program set in motion in Latin America in the preceding years. Therefore, the Convention reproduced a developmentalist ethos with a strong focus on social and economic affairs. Material uplift was the most direct way to bring indigenous populations to civilization. But this was not the sole dimension of the Convention. Relying on the doctrines of community development that were present on the Andean program, the new standards aimed at nation building and political integration as well. The Convention stated that indigenous populations should enjoy citizenship rights equal to those of the remaining national community. The idea of integration, both in political, social, and economic terms, was central to the entire Convention. And yet, the draft referred to the need to avoid forced assimilation and protected the customary rights regulating land tenure, traditions, handicraft, and even local political and administrative organization. While no indigenous representative participated in the drafting or in these debates that led to the Convention, and despite the strong integrationist tone, it did nonetheless establish some degree of protection for these communities, their institutions, and practices. When the Convention was promulgated, and now I'm moving to the Portuguese Empire, which is the focus of this conversation, but I really need to talk about the Belgians. Portugal was then a United Nations member state for 2 years, since 1955. As you all might know, the Portuguese government refused to provide information on colonial realities to the organization, arguing that Portugal was a multi-continental, multiracial, yet unitary state. Portugal did not administer no non-self-governing territory after the constitutional revision of 1951. Yet, the Portuguese thesis came under immediate attack in New York. How could the Portuguese government argue that all territories were self-governing if well more than half of the Portuguese population was not granted citizenship status? While Portuguese representatives at UN refuted all the attacks, invoking the sui generis nature of the Portuguese nation, imperial administration engaged in regular and intense debates on how to deal with this kind of critiques, especially those focusing on so-called indigenous regime. Franco Nogueira, who would later become Foreign Affairs Minister, attended the first international labor conference that dealt with the indigenous question in 1956. Roughly at the same time, he and Adriano Moreira were meeting their Belgian counterparts in the United Nations. A couple of years later, Franco Nogueira presided on the newly created Interministerial Committee for the United Nations. There, João da Costa Freitas from the Overseas Ministry argued at some point that an alternative to repealing the indigenato regime was to ratify the Convention on Indigenous Populations in Independent Countries. For a couple of years then, Costa Freitas had been in charge of studying the Belgian thesis and its potential contribution for solving the, I'm quoting, indigenous question, or questão indígena. Now, he argued that the situation of indigenous populations in Portuguese colonies was similar to that of indigenous communities in Latin America or in Australia or New Zealand. International standards also fit well Portuguese dual legislation. The Portuguese claimed they were bringing natives, and I'm quoting, to civilization, while at the same time protecting their traditional institutions and customs. In face of the bad reputation the word indígena had earned internationally, the solution was to legally rename them as Aborigines. There were some problems too. The definition of indígena was explicitly based on racial criteria, only applying to black individuals, and the convention established that indigenous populations should have the same political and civil rights of the remaining population of the state, which blatantly did not happen in the Portuguese case. For the time being, the committee just recommended that the government made acquisition of citizenship earlier. A couple of years later, in October 1960, the Portuguese stand in the UN was becoming shakier. After a protracted juridical dispute, the United Nations, now with a solid majority composed of Global South representatives, established that Portuguese territories were non-self-governing. In the same UN session, what came to be the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Peoples and Countries was announced and approved. From New York, the Portuguese UN mission urged the government to repeal the indigenato regime. Electoral legislation should be revised as well in order to limit the impact of the ratification, that is, to limit the access to votes of the former indigenous. The Overseas Ministry, in particular Costa Freitas, rejected the possibility. Instead, it suggested that the government should ratify the Convention on Indigenous Populations of the ILO. The Portuguese government did so in November 1960, 1 month before the approval of the Declaration on the Independence of Colonial Peoples and Territories. In the months that followed, as we all know, colonial war erupted in Angola, and the Portuguese colonial question became increasingly internationalized. In September 1961, Adriano Moreira was now overseas minister, repealed the indigenato regime. Yet, as some authors have shown, that was not the only legislative measure adopted. In the same day, there was a decree dealing with the reorganization of the regedorias, the application and functioning of customary law and institutions, and the reorganization of land tenure in these particular spaces. By then, the Undersecretary of State for Overseas Administration was Costa Freitas himself. In the same year, Costa Freitas presented his BA dissertation under Moreira's supervision, which dealt with the concept of indigenous in Portuguese legislation. Freitas' dissertation devoted a substantial portion of the study not to former colonial thinkers, but to authors such as Alfonso Caso and Manuel Gamio, leading indigenistas in Latin America. Adriano Moreira himself, in the decree repealing the indigenato regime, referred to the conventions on indigenous populations. What did these reforms actually mean? There are for sure different ways to look at them, but in a certain sense, they just reenact and reconfigure this tension between integration and incorporation in one hand, the preservation and protection dynamics on the other. Actually, in a decree signed by Moreira, references to assimilation, which were common in Portuguese rhetoric until that time, gave way to the idea of protection. According to Moreira, and I'm quoting this, I'm using his expression, contemporarization with local customs, traditions, and particular forms of political organization was a distinct feature of Portuguese intercultural encounter for centuries. Of course, it also entailed a wide discretion for colonial administration powers in the absence of proper legal guarantees and institutions. On a closer look, indeed, the new regedorias were to a certain extent spaces where European law and institutions did not apply, where land remained under the purview of customary law, and no individual property of land could be allowed. Yet the Portuguese government could argue that there was no racial discrimination in legislation, and that all Portuguese subjects were now, in theory, citizens. Portugal, as several other political formations in distinct geographies, had citizens who were in different stages on the ladder of development. The less developed citizens should be progressively integrated in the political and social life of the state, but their communities and traditions should be protected. In a nutshell, A dual legal and political regime persisted, but now defined through collective criteria, not individual ones. The overwhelming majority of former indigenous would remain under the purview of the regedorias, subject to customary law for private matters, governed by traditional authorities and obviously by colonial discretion. While in theory they were now citizens, political rights remain mostly bare to these populations, as electoral enrollment rates reveals. In the years that followed, the information the Portuguese government sent to the ILO concerning the Convention on Indigenous Populations aimed to match its developmentalist tone. Schemes of reordenamento rural and associated policies were profusely distributed in Geneva. There one can read that the main goals of reordenamento rural, which was based on the doctrines, according to the Portuguese, of community development, aim at modernize the traditional milieu, make agriculture more productive, develop infrastructures, but also aimed at accelerating the process, and I'm quoting now, accelerating the process of elevation of all rural inhabitants to civilization, and I'm quoting again, effective constitution of multiracial societies fully stable and integrated. Yet, while there are some references to the need to preserve the social and traditional balance, references to environment in these reports, or to environment preservation or conservation in these reports, seem to be rarer, except for some concerns, for instance, about soil erosion. Yet, until 1972, when the ILO, after intense pressure by the United Nations, decided that the convention did not apply to the Portuguese colonies, since they were not independent countries, the Portuguese government stubbornly refused to reply to one single question: what was the numerical weight of these populations, and how did they exercise their political and civil rights? At this point, more research is needed in order to assess to what extent in this process did environmental questions emerge within the imperial administrative chain in connection with several plans of modernization then enacted, but also with evolving and increasingly hostile international environment. It's quite possible that they were secondary at this point, as the Portuguese government was more focused in ascertaining its sovereign legitimacy over overseas territories, namely by deploying a discourse and a set of policies that aimed at economic development, political integration, and nation building, while at the same time demonstrating the intercultural hybrid nature of the Portuguese Empire, namely through the preservation of traditional lifestyles, folklore, and communities. But even if environment protection or preservation was not explicitly present in the priorities of the imperial and colonial governments, that in itself is revealing. For the time being, I can advise, and I'm just concluding, I'm really sorry. For the time being, I can advance some very preliminary conclusions. In the post-war years, a global conversation and dispute unfolded that brought together the imperative of social and economic development, the need to preserve what were seen as less developed social spaces, associated traditions and customs, but also the need to integrate ethnic and culturally different human groups in what came to be regarded as the only legitimate form of political organization, the nation state. This was a fraught and convoluted history that involved different sides in the Cold War, but also imperial, settler, colonial, and post-colonial states, and distinct NGOs and networks. By looking specifically to indigenous international law, one can notice that environmental questions were not the most pressing questions at the time. According to Luís Rodrigo Pinheiro, the 1957 convention mostly focused on the conflictual dynamics of integration and protection, and emphasizing the human rights regime particular focus on individual rights. This will become in the late 1970s and 1980s, though, the international legal instrument through which the increasingly vocal transnational indigenous movement raised new claims about collective rights, including environmental ones, associated to claims on land tenure and property of natural resources. In 1989, environmental questions will be integrated and is explicitly stated in the new ILO Convention on Indigenous Populations. And in 2007, the United Nations will finally establish the self-determination right of indigenous populations in independent countries, which did not, and this is important, did not translate into national independence. It's a different kind of self-determination, and to a certain extent, this is the recovering of the Belgian thesis argument. So I think I've went out of time. Thank you so much for your attention.
No, thank you so much for this paper. We will discuss it. And so it came with a very stimulating analysis of this crucial period of time. We'll go back to it. And now we have Dr. José Miguel Ferreira, who did his PhD recently, which is very, very nice. And so he's at the start of his academic career. And he moved, so there is a novelty because I still had the Institute of Social Sciences in Lisbon. He moved to the Institute of Contemporary History at Nova University. And so he did most of his work on Goa, first with an MA on the period after 1640, and then with environmental issues concerning the history of colonial Goa, and that's what he's going to talk about: Into the Woods, Nature, Forests, and Colonialism in 19th Century Goa.
Thank you. I hope it's working. Good afternoon. I would like to begin by thanking the organization of this symposium, and in particular Professor Francisco Tencourt for the invitation to be present in this meeting with so many friends, colleagues, and historians I admire so much. The materials I am presenting today are, for the most part, a product of my PhD thesis, where, among other things, I looked into the attempts by the Portuguese colonial authorities to control, manage, and commodify the forests and natural resources of the small Portuguese colony of Goa on the western coast of India during the long 19th century. Before I get on with my presentation, I would like to make one or two preliminary remarks on this topic. Looking at forests and colonial forestry is hardly an original take on the environmental history of empires. As Corey Ross put it in his recent book, forests were a key focal point of colonial attempts to control, conquer territories, and profit from their natural resources. But the choice of Goa as a case study probably warrants some explanation, especially since the Portuguese territories in Asia in the 19th and 20th centuries are often portrayed as a kind of half-forgotten remnant of the past, of little or no consequence to the larger history of colonialism. And yet, it was in Goa that the first modern forest department was created in a Portuguese colony in 1851, in the exact same period when similar institutions began to appear in British-controlled South Asia. So by the end of this presentation, I hope I have convinced you that Goa is an interesting case study, not only to consider the environmental legacies of Portuguese colonialism, but also to think about the broader environmental history of colonial South Asia. So to begin with, from the moment when the Portuguese conquered Goa, these are not the Portuguese conquering Goa, I hope, in the early 16th century, access to forest resources played an essential, even though rarely mentioned, role in the life of the colony. As a strong, versatile, and relatively cheap material, wood was important both to the Portuguese authorities and to the local populations. It was needed for shipbuilding, as Amelia has shown this morning, but also to build the fortresses and churches that buttressed imperial rule, or to maintain the irrigation networks that sustained local agriculture. Wood was also found in all sorts of everyday utensils and in some luxury objects, as we can see in the inventories of Portuguese officials and Goan elites. The problem was that the island of Goa, or Tissuadi, where the Portuguese first established themselves, was virtually devoid of timber trees. This situation changed somewhat after the 1540s with the annexation of the neighboring territories of Salsette and Bardej. But still, timber, firewood, and other forest resources remained scarce, and for the most part had to be brought in from outside the colony. Part of these resources could be supplied by the moist deciduous forests of the Western Ghats that separated Goa and the Konkan coast from the interior of the Indian subcontinent. For example, most of the firewood that was consumed in Bardej came from the neighboring region of Bicholim. Other kinds of forest produce, including the mareta, or in Konkani, mati wood, that was essential for building the sluice gates for the irrigation of rice fields, were brought from the upland forests that by the late 17th century were under the control of the Rajas of Sonda. So this commerce rested on pre-existing networks of trade through which wood was cut in the forests, dragged by oxen or buffaloes into nearby waterways, and then transported downstream into Goa. Besides this interland trade, some timber, particularly the teak that was indispensable for shipbuilding and relatively scarce in these regions, had to be brought in from further away, either from the Malabar coast to the south, or from the areas that confined with the Portuguese territory of the Província do Norte in what is now northern Maharashtra. In fact, by the late 1600s, easier access to teak meant that most shipbuilding operations have moved to Bassein and Damau in the north. Nonetheless, wood was still needed for all kinds of constructions and for repairs on the often battered ships of the Carreira de India. So as a result, surviving records from the Portuguese administration, like this copybook of the correspondence sent by the Vedor da Fazenda in the 1740s, show a constant preoccupation with access to timber supplies. My purpose with this rather lengthy description is to highlight that for the first 2 centuries of Portuguese rule in Goa, the colonial authorities saw the supply of wood and its byproducts essentially as a logistical problem. So timber was bought through local intermediaries, transported into Goa, and then utilized. This began to change between the late 18th century and the early 19th century, with a shift towards a more direct intervention of the colonial authorities in controlling and managing forest resources. To an extent, this shift reflected broader changes in the ways in which the improvement and management of nature was conceptualized, in a context marked by the emerging disciplines of natural history and political economy, and by what some authors have described as a kind of practical enlightenment. This has been well established not only for the British and French empires, but also for Spanish America and Brazil. I think it's also important to note that this aspiration for a closer management of resources and people was not confined to European empires. It was present in late 18th century Ottoman Egypt, as Alan Mikhail has shown. And in different ways, it was also a feature of the new regional states that were consolidating their power over South Asia. So returning to the Portuguese Empire, the late 1700s saw an increasing interest in knowing and controlling forest resources. This can be seen in Portugal itself, with some limited attempts to reorganize the management of royal forests, but especially in Brazil, where, as José Augusto Padua has convincingly argued, there was a growing awareness of the environmental impact of deforestation, leading to attempts to regulate the exploitation of forests, and by 1797 to the appointment of a conservator for the forests of Ilhéus, in what is now the state of Bahia. Moreover, while the centrality of Brazil cannot be overstated, it's important to recognize that this was an empire-wide preoccupation. We can see that in an object like this cabinet of timber samples from different parts of the empire, mainly Brazil, commissioned by the future King Dom João VI in 1805, but also in the successive attempts to acclimatize teak trees from India in Portugal, in Brazil, and even in Angola. In the case of Goa, this increasingly interventionist approach towards woodlands and their resources took 2 main forms. The first was an attempt to plant teak and other timber trees in the coastal regions. By the early 19th century, however, this has mostly failed. More consequential was the expansion of Portuguese rule into the foothills of the Western Ghats in the last decades of the 18th century. We don't have time to attend to the details of this process, but by the early 1800s, the territory of Goa had increased threefold with the annexation of almost 3,000 square kilometers of densely forested territories that would become known as the New Conquests. It's this area, gray area here. It's important to note here that these forests were hardly as untouched as later colonial discourses portrayed them. As we have seen, wood and other forest products were part of trade networks. Even at a more local level, forests provided many of the resources essential for local livelihoods, besides serving as a refuge in times of warfare and sometimes as places of religious cult. Forests were frequently burned for sweden or kumri cultivation or to clear the ground for cattle grazing. Moreover, they were also a source of revenue for the different regional polities, landholders, and village elites who charged tributes on the extraction of timber and firewood, and also on the trade of products like gums and honey. So in this sense, we have to see these forests as anthropogenic landscapes. In the aftermath of the annexation of these regions, the main priority of the Portuguese was to incorporate these sources of revenue. In the 1760s, however, we see the first tentative attempt to regulate access to forests. In the 1760s, in 1766, there was a prohibition on the cutting of thick trees. In 1777, by a general restriction on cutting of trees deemed proper for shipbuilding, that was renewed in 1788. In the same year, we have the appointment of a Goan naturalist, Francisco Luís de Menezes, to survey these forests. So by the early 19th century, we have an incipient regime of forest management in Goa, focused mainly on the control of specific timber trees for shipbuilding purposes. What we will see over the following decades is a gradual shift from this regime of control focused on some trees to a regime of control focused on forest spaces. We can point to different reasons for this. From the outset, the triumph of constitutional liberalism in the early 1800s led to the consolidation of new technologies of rule and to a greater emphasis on legislative codification and state control. That was seen as particularly important in regions where that control was weak, like the new conquests. This preoccupation with colonial state-making was accompanied by a growing anxiety over the depletion of Goan forests as a waste of public resources that would be increasingly tied to a critique of the backwardness and wastefulness of local agricultural practices, what Richard Drayton has called the myths of the profligate native, which led to ever more stringent restrictions on Khmer agriculture, so shifting agriculture. For example, through legislation that prohibited the seasonal migrations of some people from the coasts to the forests to practice shifting agriculture, but also on cattle grazing, which particularly impacted semi-itinerant communities. Finally, we can see some references to the influence of forests on climate, rainfall, and agriculture, but far from the full-blown desiccationist discourses that Richard Grove has identified for British India. By 1545, this mix of political, economic, and environmental concerns led to the creation of the post of forest administrator or administrador das matas in Goa. 6 years later, in 1851, this lone official had given way to a fully formed forestry administration, a Administração das Matas de Goa, supported by a specific legislative framework, the Regulamento da Administração das Matas de Goa, we can see here. We know that the Portuguese authorities were aware of the initiatives that were underway in the neighboring regions with the appointment of a conservator of forests in Bombay in 1847. But the main model was the project of a forest code encompassing both metropolitan and colonial territories that was discussed in the Portuguese parliament throughout the 1840s and which was later abandoned. So we have a kind of curious situation where the only initiative, as far as I know, that aimed at legislating the administration of forests for the entirety of the Portuguese Empire only had this kind of afterlife in Goa. Compared to the metropolitan legislation, however, the Goan Regulamento had a more expansive view of its remit, encompassing not only the so-called state forests, but also the loosely defined wastelands, incultos e baldios, that were considered to be under the direct overlordship of the colonial state. And this is similar to what Coldo has mentioned for Madeira, included very harsh penalties for a litany of newly defined forest crimes, harsher than those that were present in the metropole. In this sense, what we have after 1851 is colonial forest management as a form of territorial control, with the new conquests divided into 4 circumscriptions, each headed by a forest guard under the supervision of the forest administrator. Local rights and uses, including shifting cultivation and cattle grazing, were not completely curtailed, but they were heavily restricted, and the stricter separation between forests and agricultural lands was enforced. Here, I think it is important to note that in many ways, forest management was part of a larger effort to domesticate and civilize the territory and the population of the new conquests in this period, which also included a reorganization of the civilian and military administration and the codification of local uses and customs. From the get-go, these regulations elicited a pushback, motivating several complaints from local populations and provoking a large-scale rebellion, led by this gentleman here, Dipo Reines, which engulfed the new conquests between 1852 and 1855. And I'm mentioning this because I think it's important to note that these attempts to control forests met with overt and covert resistance from local populations throughout the 19th and 20th century. So moving on towards the end of the presentation, we can see that the history of Portuguese attempts to control the forests of Goa, much like in other colonial and even European contexts, was largely shaped by a constant negotiation between the overarching ambitions of the forest administration, the practical constraints of its resources, and the resistance of local populations and local environments. What we see until the early 1900s, when there was a major reform of the agricultural and forest services of Goa, are several attempts to survey and demarcate state forests, an expansion of the personnel to include several dozen more guards and wardens, most of them local Goans, and limited efforts to implement a kind of scientific management of resources. Still, while it is essential to emphasize the novelty of colonial scientific forestry and its impact on local rights and environments, I think it is also important to note that it was marked by some continuities. So, for example, until the late 1880s, a significant part of the revenue came from a thinly disguised recycling of pre-colonial tributes on the cutting of mango and jack trees and on the trade in minor forest products. Moreover, we also need to be careful in establishing a linear connection from knowledge production to the exercise of colonial power over nature. By 1912, for example, the forest administrator complained that maps like these ones served for little more than to decorate the walls of his office. And in that same year, the Goan medical doctor and public intellectual Francisco Olfang da Silva also produced a severe critique of Portuguese forest administration, quoting a supposed British forester who stated that Goa is a paradise, what a pity you don't care much for it. So I will use this quote to end with just 2 or 3 concluding remarks. The first is that this notion of the inadequacy and irrelevance of Portuguese colonial rule, particularly when compared with the British example, was pervasive among both Portuguese officials and Goan intellectuals, and still permeates much historical writing on the 19th and 20th centuries. It's probably one of the reasons why no other historian has devoted more than 2 or 3 lines to the history of colonial forestry in Goa. And yet, if there is one main argument I would like to make with this paper, is that, as Tiago Saraiva has shown quite eloquently in his book, Fascist Pigs, we can gain a lot by going beyond the simple metric of success and failure that is in itself a colonial construct. In the first place, because if we look at it from the point of view of the local populations, for whom the forest administration was probably the most immediate manifestation of colonial power, and who saw their rights and livelihoods impacted, Portuguese interventions into the forests of Goa were everything but irrelevant. In the second place, and I'm really finishing, because disregarding the environmental impact of Portuguese colonialism in Asia in the 19th and 20th centuries, and I'm thinking not only about forests, but mining in Goa, coffee plantations in East Timor, or the complete transformation of the built environment of Macau, we are perpetuating a truncated vision of the Portuguese Empire that sees the 16th century as important in Asia, and then Brazil, and then Africa. But there is more to this story. And finally, and returning specifically to forestry and to Goa, because the peculiar location of Goa in between empires can point us towards a more complex understanding of colonial interventions in the forests of South and Southeast Asia. So to play with Dipesh Chakrabarty's expression, it can help us provincialize British India and move on towards a more complex picture that takes into account well-known cases like the Dutch East Indies, but also lesser-known ones like Portuguese India, French Indochina, the Spanish Philippines, or even non-European states like more or less independent Siam, or even the Japanese colonial empire in Taiwan and Korea. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this rich paper, and it's open to questions. Well, good. So I have immediately José Vicente Serrão.
Thank you. I have just a small question to José Pedro, and this is about the concept, or better, the word indigenous. I don't want to discuss the word or the concept because this is a kind of an endless discussion, or even useless. But perhaps you can tell us a bit more about why and when that word got a bad reputation.
No, I just looked to the watch.
Because some time ago I used to think that that was a Portuguese thing connected with some kind of internal domestic issues. But now, and for instance, since 2007, there is a United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Rights. So the word is totally recovered and totally accepted now, I suppose, in the literature that we find in the United States and elsewhere. The word is also used interchangeably with native. If you know something else about this, please.
Katya. What I suggest is that we have 3 or 4 brief questions, then they answer, and we need to move fast because we have Décio Guzman waiting for the Zoom somewhere now in Pará. So we need to go faster. Yes, please.
The question is short, Zé Pedro, but I don't think the answer will be. You said very cynically at the end of your talk that yes, and now we are back to the Belgian project of thinking about the idea of the indigenous. I would like you to elaborate on that, please. Are we going back where we were in 1957? So what are the differences? I know you were being a bit provocative, but so, and my second question is José Miguel, thank you so much. This is very interesting. And I would like to ask, again, I think a simple question that will not be easy to answer. There is an association made within Dutch historiography on the Dutch East Indies, so Indonesia, about deforestation and the redefinition of regimes of colonial citizenship. That is to say, a transition from subjecthood to citizenship. who has access to the forest and how labor regimes are imposed upon the forest, and through those, regimes of citizenship or lack thereof are actually imposed. I wonder, because you mentioned Macau, you mentioned the coffee plantation in East Timor, I wonder whether you find relation to this idea, moving out of subjecthood, early modern colonial, into the imperial, the vision of citizenship of empire that is far more reductive, and the box is far smaller, let's put it like that. And how does the forest resources play into this? For the Dutch East Indies, there is literature that is the case. Just wondering.
So I suppose it was called, yeah, and then Barbara.
Well, I cannot talk very loudly. Thank you, Marta. My question goes to Miguel. If you don't have time, I can wait to the beer part. So, my question, I think you mentioned something very important, that the crown, or state, whatever, does not try to eliminate, rather to curtail, to cut, to reduce the access of the local inhabitants to the wood. My question related to be, who were the foresters? Have you done a prosopography about them? Because in Portugal, what I found, that the crown, even though they said, I am going to forbid everything, the reality is that they allowed the access because the foresters were the same that were agriculture. And they live in the nearby territory, so they couldn't forbid them the access to them.
Barbara.
I have two quick questions for Zé. The first one, you mentioned desiccation and the anti-desiccation discourse, and you argued that in the case of Goa, you didn't see the same concern with that question in that period, whereas Grove has shown that at the same time the British were particularly concerned with that. I was wondering, why do you think that is the case? And you also mentioned that livestock grazing and shifting agriculture were not completely curtailed by the regulations. And I was wondering what kind of practices were allowed and why they were allowed, and if the reasons were perhaps political also, and which practice were banned, and if it has any other explanation other than preserving forests or whatever. Thank you.
Please brief, sorry, Amélia.
So, Miguel, first of all, thank you so much. I was one of those that Goa for me only existed until the 18th century. Now we are much more interested in it. So just thinking with you, if there is not shipbuilding, as I have formulated for 16th century, or the traditional needs of early modern presence in Goa and in India that stimulated these kind of ordinances, why do you think it emerges in this context? It's just emulating the same kind of procedures that they have in the metropolis, because they do have also in Portugal. Is that because of the concerns of the natural philosophers that obviously put also pressure to that? And you mentioned Francisco Luís Menezes, which might be an important character on this. Just try to explain why this importance. And thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Yes, please briefly. We can go back to it at the end of this afternoon.
Okay. So to begin with, I think I can only give either a very short or a very long answer to Katya's question, which is great. If I understood correctly, what you're saying is that in the Dutch East Indies, what happens is an imposition of labor regimes on the forests, and this is connected with citizenship. I don't know exactly how citizenship was enacted in the Dutch East Indies during the 19th century. I should reread Stoller probably, but in Portugal, in Portuguese Goa, in theory, everyone was a citizen. What happened is that throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, there are some attempts to impose labor regimes to plantations and later, especially through mining, on these forest populations. But there is not the kind of tribalization, if I can put it like this, that you see in South Asia, where there is a clear distinction between caste and non-caste people. So coastal, in the case of Goa, coastal peoples would be seen as caste civilized people, citizens, future citizens, and then the forest people were seen as tribals. In the case of Goa, that happened only after independence. So you have a kind of strange status where semi-itinerant people whose rights are curtailed, who are subject to kind of orientalization, both by the Portuguese and the Goans themselves. But at the same time, they are citizens, they can vote, they never do. Someone votes for them, and this is not just for them, but for almost everyone in the new conquests, but they can vote, they are citizens. So I think it's a kind of strange situation, and it's particularly interesting the way in which, after independence, many of these groups are trying to claim tribal, tribal and other backward castes, and they are trying to claim these rights to be able to access special reservations that they did not have under this universal citizenship that the Portuguese supposedly had. Moving on to Koldo and Barbara, I think I can join two of the questions, which is the practices that were curtailed but not eliminated. This goes back and forth throughout the old 19th and early 20th centuries. Sometimes they try to ban, sometimes they reach the decision that people need to survive somehow, and this is important to local livelihood, so we cannot curtail it completely, or we end up with a rebellion. So it's mostly political, and it's also because, and this connects with the desiccationism part, most of the supposedly head foresters were to be people trained in silvicultural forestry. They only in the 20th century is that true. So throughout the 19th century, most of them are Portuguese descendants, military men. And then at the end of the 19th century, you have a series of Portuguese agronomists, but not foresters. They have some training at the Institute of Agriculture, but they are not foresters. And then only in the 20th century, you have foresters. And so you never have the development of sophisticated desiccationist discourse and its contrary that you see with growth, with the medical officers of the East India Company. Because most of the people we are talking about here are the governors themselves, are military men, military engineers. They have training, they have knowledge. But a thing I found fascinating was that the most sophisticated discussion of desiccationism was not in the reports of the Forestry Administration, but was on the Goan newspapers. So Goan elites often use references that the Portuguese administrators themselves were not using. They were mostly talking about state power, control over resources. This is a public resource that needs to be enforced and secured. And this connects finally really quickly with what Amelia said, which is a paradox. Shipbuilding ends and then you have control over forests. Partly because beforehand you did not have direct rule over heavily forested regions. Then there is an attempt to start building ships again that goes until the 1860s. You have the idea that Goa will be able to have shipbuilding again. And then because you need wood for every kinds of timber for every kinds of buildings, so the reconstruction of Goa after you move from old Goa to Panjim needs a lot of wood. And then at the end of the century, because of the Murmugão Railway, so fuel for the railway for 3 or 4 decades is the main source of revenue for the administration. So shipbuilding never disappears as an ambition, and then you have all these other ideas that go towards forests as a kind of infrastructure of the state, and you have to control it. I think that's it.
Okay, so I'll try to be very brief. We can continue this conversation during the beers. I think it's easier because two quick replies to the question, what about the concept of indigenous? Lost in translation and the problem of international institutions and international law. These are two connected questions that often we don't think about. So basically, in the International Labour Organization, in the interwar years, there was this definition of, in English, the Native Labor Code of the ILO, that is a special international standards for colonial territories, native workers, that basically applied to every kind of territory. That is where there were backward populations, both in Latin America and Africa, in Asia, etc. This is in the interwar years. After 1945, with decolonization looming in the horizon, things start to change, and that native is not anymore, has not a good reputation in the same way that indigenous has not a good reputation for us. So basically what happened after 1945 is that the ILO refers to non-metropolitan territories, not natives. This is more complex than this because it also changes the kind of criteria for defining backwardness, not individual, but territorial. So, but what happens is with non-metropolitan territories, the expression native is not used anymore. But the thing is that in English, native is pejorative, but not indigenous. And in French, it's precisely the opposite, due to the indigène regime, mostly. Indigène is something that has not a very good reputation. So basically, for a long time, the way that they saw also in Latin America, indígena has also no bad reputation. So basically, what happened is that the British and the Spanish basically make that indigenous became the definition. So, but the definition of indigenous only appears clearly in international law in 1957 with this convention, which focuses in indigenous peoples in independent countries. And this is related to the second question with, that Katia asked, but I will go there in a minute. So what happened is that indigenous starts being referred in international law to people in independent countries. Of course, we can ask what are independent countries. That's what the Belgians were asking. But there is this distinction in international law between native and indigena, which I would translate in Portuguese and French from indigena and aboriginal. What the Portuguese are trying to do is just to say this is all the same, and the Belgians as well. This is a problem of civilization development. So all these peoples are equal. So that's the sacred trust of civilization. The problem is that in the definition of indigenous is indigenous, tribal, and semi-tribal. And why is that? Because post-colonial states, for instance, in Africa, say all our population is indigenous. So we have to establish this kind of different degrees of civilization or development, because civilization is not being used. So we're going to call them tribal, not indigenous, because, for instance, and you have a very interesting case in Liberia, you have the population back from the United States, who basically the Belgians are saying they are doing this is the worst kind of colonialism. These are people that former slaves from the United States who are civilized, and you have, written law in the cities, but in the interland, you have customary law. It's precisely the model of the indigena applied to Liberia in 1961, 1962. So basically when the Ghana files a complaint against Portugal for violation of Convention on Forced Labor, the Portuguese filed in August 1961, you have to bear in mind, just in the middle of the storm in the United Nations, they filed a complaint against Liberia, not only because they are also, using forced labor, because they have a very dual regime there as well. So very complex story. Jumping to Katya's question, there is one problem when I'm going through these, because there are a lot of debates about the Belgian thesis in international law, none of it in history. But the thing is that you go through this in international law, and it's like laws just pop up in the air. They have no history. And basically the distinction between what was how could the self-determination right be ascribed, was defined in very precise ways. The Portuguese were central in this debate. This is basically something that emerges from the early 1950s until the 1960s, when the Declaration on the Concession of Independence, basically, and other resolutions passed in the same General Assembly established. To earn self-determination, the focus was the territory. It had to be, non-contiguous. It had to be racially and ethnically different. And so basically, and what's that? This is a document of international law, but basically why it took so long to be defined in this way? Because basically the composition of the United Nations changed as the colonization unfolded. So basically this is, the Belgians said there is no, internal coherence in this legal argument. But the thing is that there is no coherence, but there is it in law or there is not. And the thing is that and answering to the questions, these people at this point believe there were differences between land empires and overseas empires, and that matter. And in fact, we are, just to finish, Francisco, you're looking at me, I see that, but we are talking about some concepts that became common currency in the 21st century, some of them a little bit in the late 20th century. And we are trying to think about how we use these concepts to think about the 15th century. In your case, you suggested we go back further, but we are not thinking about the 20th century. And some of these formative concepts that we use now to think about history were constructed historically at this time, namely the distinction between land empires and overseas empires. One are legitimate, the others are not. So basically what indigenous people said using the Belgian thesis was, what about us? We are also subject to colonization. We also have a diminished status, and we should have international protection. So what about this? Basically, to have support from other post-colonial states, mostly in Africa, they have to say, okay, self-determination, but not political independence. And that's how self-determination became an indigenous right in 2007 in the UN Convention, but it was a long time. And Belgian thesis was the critique, the rationale is all there.
Thank you so much. Sorry, only 10 minutes break. I think we have coffee. Yes.